Welcome to Life Stories, where we dive into real-life experiences, full of lessons, struggles, and triumphs. Today's story is about Sophie, a woman who spent years supporting her husband, only to discover a web of lies and betrayal that would change her life forever. From the pain of deceit to the strength she found in herself. Sophie's journey is a powerful reminder that sometimes, the hardest lessons lead to the most empowering victories. Sit back and relax as we begin today's story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start the journey with us. Sophie sat quietly at the breakfast table, the gentle rays of the morning sun spilling through the wide glass windows of their sleek, modern home. She sipped her tea, the warmth of the cup against her fingers a small comfort as she gazed out at the peaceful garden. Feeling the calmness of the moment. To the outside world, everything seemed perfect. She had a successful husband, Richard, a thriving business, and a home that many would envy. They were the epitome of a perfect couple. But lately, Sophie had felt something shift. A subtle but undeniable change in Richard's behavior that she couldn't ignore. It started with small things. His affection had grown distant. His kisses no longer lingered in the mornings. And the phone calls that once kept them connected throughout the day had become rare. He no longer asked for her opinion or included her in decisions that once mattered to both of them. Instead, he became more and more absorbed in his work, often working late into the night, leaving Sophie to wonder what had happened to the man she married. Sophie had always believed in their love, had always convinced herself that as long as she supported him and made sacrifices for his success, their bond would remain unbreakable. She had always been Richard's biggest cheerleader. The one who stood by him as he built his career from the ground up. She had used her savings to support his business venture when it seemed too risky. Handled their finances with care. And worked behind the scenes, making sure their lives were running smoothly, all while allowing Richard to take the credit. It had never mattered to her. She was his partner, his backbone. But now, as Sophie stared at the quiet breakfast table, the absence of Richard's presence felt louder than ever. He had barely spoken to her that morning. A mere nod and a quick kiss on the cheek before he rushed out the door with a briefcase in hand. He didn't even look back. The words he had said before leaving, "I have a late meeting. Don't wait up," were cold and final, and Sophie couldn't help but feel the emptiness in his voice. "Will you be home early today?" she had asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice trembled slightly, betraying the anxiety growing inside her. "I thought we could have dinner together." But there was no reaction. Just the faint sound of his footsteps as he walked out without another glance. Sophie sat back in her chair, her heart heavy with a growing sense of unease. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, lost in thought. Was it her imagination? Or was something more sinister at play? Was Richard losing interest in her? Or was there something else? Something she wasn't seeing? The questions swirled in her mind, each one sinking deeper into her chest like a stone. Over the years, Sophie had convinced herself that love was about patience, about supporting the other person no matter what, about being there through the highs and lows. But now, for the first time, she wondered if that kind of love had been enough for Richard. He seemed so distant, so preoccupied. Sophie could no longer ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind that something was wrong. She tried to push the thought away. Tried to convince herself it was just a phase, that it would pass. But deep down, she knew better. Later that afternoon, as she sat at her desk in the home office, Sophie could hardly concentrate on her work. Her eyes kept drifting to the bank statements she had been reviewing for the past hour. Sophie had always been meticulous with money, perhaps even more so since she had been handling the finances for both her and Richard. The numbers had always made sense to her, clear, structured, logical. But today, as she scrutinized the transactions, something caught her attention, something that didn't quite add up. Richard had always managed the corporate accounts, but Sophie had made it a point to keep an eye on their finances. She had done so for years, ensuring there was a financial safety net for them both. So why were there large sums of money disappearing from their joint account? The descriptions next to the withdrawals read like a code Sophie didn't understand: business expenses, investment funding, and corporate travel, all within the past 6 months. Sophie's stomach sank as she clicked through each transaction. This wasn't careless spending, it was calculated. There was something hidden behind these numbers. Something she hadn't been told. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering if she was overreacting. But she knew she had to ask him. She dialed Richard's number, and he answered on the third ring. His voice distracted. "Wendy, I'm in a meeting," he muttered, barely acknowledging her. Sophie ignored his excuse. "Richard, I just went through our bank statements. Why are there thousands of dollars withdrawn from our joint account for business expenses I don't recognize?" There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was sharp, dismissive. "Sophie, do I question the way you spend money on your little projects? Trust me, everything is under control." But Sophie's fingers tightened around the phone. "I'm your wife, Richard. I think I have the right to know where our money is going." His voice grew even sharper. "I said it's under control," he snapped, and the call ended abruptly. Sophie stared at her phone, her heart racing. She knew something was wrong. She had trusted him, had sacrificed so much for their life together. But now, for the first time, she felt as though Richard was hiding something from her. And she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far darker than she was prepared to face. A week passed, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in a house of cards. And it was all about to come crashing down. As much as she tried to convince herself that everything was fine. The weight of Richard's coldness and the unexplained financial withdrawals gnawed at her every day. She couldn't rest, couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time Richard came home late or casually brushed off her concerns, Sophie felt her world slipping further out of her control. That afternoon, Sophie found herself standing in a high-end boutique, running her fingers along the soft fabric of an emerald green dress on display. It was the kind of dress she would never buy for herself, extravagant, expensive, and impractical. But today, something felt different. She was no longer browsing idly. Her thoughts were sharp and focused, as if a piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. The sales assistant walked by, and Sophie, trying to appear casual, asked, "Has anyone recently bought this in a size 6? The young woman nodded enthusiastically, her voice filled with excitement. "Oh, yes. A gentleman bought it just a few days ago. He was very particular about the size. A beautiful gift for someone special." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The words rang in her ears. A sickening realization settling over her. Richard had made another withdrawal that week. Nearly the exact price of this dress. But it hadn't been for her. It wasn't even for their anniversary or any special occasion. This was for someone else. Sophie stood frozen, her mind racing. Who was this woman? Was it someone Richard was seeing on the side? A younger, more exciting woman. Someone who didn't have the weight of years of loyalty and sacrifice behind her. She quickly left the store, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to push the thought aside. Tried to tell herself that it was just a coincidence. But deep down, Sophie knew she wasn't being paranoid. She was right. She had been right all along. Richard was spending money on someone else, someone younger. Someone worth expensive gifts. While Sophie, his wife, sat at home, clueless and heartbroken. Later that night, Sophie sat at her desk, scrolling through their joint transaction history once again. This time, she wasn't just looking for financial discrepancies, she was looking for the truth. High-end restaurant bills, luxury hotel stays, and jewelry purchases appeared one after another. But not once had Sophie received any of those things. No romantic dinners, no lavish gifts, no spontaneous getaways. Nothing for her. Sophie's hands trembled as she clicked through the pages. The evidence was right there, staring at her. Richard was living a life she didn't know about. A life funded by her. A cold fury began to settle over Sophie. She had never been an impulsive woman. Never one to jump to conclusions without solid proof. But the truth she had uncovered was undeniable. Richard wasn't just careless with their money, he was using it to fund an affair. He had been playing the role of the successful husband while secretly building a life with someone else. A life that Sophie had been paying for. All while believing in him. All while supporting him. She sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of betrayal press down on her chest. But it wasn't just the affair that stung, it was the realization that Richard had never truly seen her. He had taken everything she had given him and repaid her with deceit. She had spent years supporting him, building their future, while he was building a secret life of his own. As the days went by, Sophie's determination grew stronger. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. She wasn't going to be the woman who cried in the shadows while he lived a life of luxury. No, Sophie would fight back. She would expose him for who he truly was. And she would make him regret ever thinking that he could betray her and get away with it. Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was to come. It was time to play her hand. It was time to show Richard exactly who he was dealing with. The realization that Richard had betrayed her, that he had built a secret life funded by her sacrifices, ignited a fire within Sophie. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the deception. The arrogance with which he thought he could get away with it all. Sophie wasn't someone to act impulsively. But now, with everything laid bare before her, she knew one thing. Richard had underestimated her. He thought she would stand by him forever, blind to his lies. But he had made a fatal mistake. Sophie was no longer that woman. Her plan began to take shape slowly. With methodical precision, the first step was to get hard evidence. She couldn't confront him with suspicion alone, she needed proof. Sophie hired a private investigator. Someone discreet. Someone who specialized in uncovering the secrets of men like Richard. The investigator didn't waste any time. And within a few days, he provided Sophie with the information she needed, photographs, texts, and a full report confirming that Richard and Chloe, the woman he had been seeing, were living a double life together. Dinner dates, trips to luxurious resorts, and expensive gifts, all paid for with Sophie's money. Sophie sat in her private study, reading through the report with a cold smile on her lips. Richard had truly believed he was playing a game. He had thought he could hide behind his lies. But Sophie was playing a different game now. One that he couldn't even begin to comprehend. She wasn't going to be the woman he walked all over anymore. She wasn't going to be the woman waiting at home while he had his fun. Sophie had spent years being loyal, being supportive, being the perfect wife. But now it was her turn to rise. To take control of her own life. The next step was to hit him where it would hurt the most, his pride and his bank account. Sophie had always handled their finances with care. But now, with the proof of Richard's deceit, she had no intention of letting him continue to manipulate her. She began the process of separating their finances, making sure that everything was moved into accounts that were entirely under her control. It was a quiet, calculated move, and one Richard wouldn't even see coming. The hardest part, though, was the confrontation. Sophie had no intention of letting Richard off easy. She wasn't going to let him think he could get away with this. She knew that he would try to talk his way out of it. To convince her that everything was fine. That she was overreacting. But Sophie was prepared. She had gathered all the evidence she needed. And now, she was going to make him face the consequences of his actions. The day arrived when Sophie decided to confront Richard. He had been away on business. But Sophie knew exactly where he would be staying. At one of the luxury resorts that she had discovered during her investigation. It was a place Sophie herself owned. A stunning property that Richard had no idea was part of her empire. It was the perfect setting for Sophie to take back control. To let Richard see just how little he understood her. As she entered the resort, Sophie couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Richard had been so busy flaunting his success, so absorbed in his affair, that he hadn't even realized who he was really dealing with. Sophie wasn't just his wife. She was the woman who had built the very empire he had tried to take credit for. She was the one who had made everything possible. And now she was going to show him exactly what that meant. Sophie made her way through the grand lobby, her presence commanding attention. She didn't need to rush. She knew exactly what was going to happen next. Richard would arrive with Chloe, thinking he was the one in control. Thinking he was the one with all the power. But in reality, it was Sophie who held all the cards. As she reached the private lounge, she took a moment to collect herself. This was the moment of truth. When Richard walked through that door, he would learn that everything he had done, every lie, every betrayal, would come crashing down around him. The lounge was quiet, almost serene, as Sophie stood in the shadows, waiting for the moment when Richard and Chloe would walk through the door. It felt almost surreal to be standing here, in the very place that Richard had unknowingly chosen to play out his affair. A place that was, in fact, Sophie's own creation. She had watched him parade through these lavish settings, oblivious to the fact that he was living a lie, surrounded by the wealth Sophie had built with her own 2 hands. Sophie stood tall, a quiet strength emanating from her. She knew that everything had led to this point. Every betrayal, every sacrifice, had culminated in this final moment of reckoning. Richard and Chloe would have no idea what was about to hit them. As Sophie glanced around the room, she could almost feel the weight of the situation. The opulence of the resort, the gleaming chandeliers, the hushed conversations, all of it was a part of the elaborate setup she had orchestrated. A setup that would expose Richard for the fraud he had become. The soft click of the door opening interrupted her thoughts, and Sophie turned to see Richard and Chloe enter the room, laughing and oblivious to what was to come. Sophie watched as Richard puffed out his chest, his arrogance on full display, while Chloe clung to his arm, oblivious to the fact that she was walking straight into a trap. Sophie couldn't help but notice how carefree they were, how Richard's self-importance oozed from every pore. He had no idea what was in store for him. Sophie's lips curled into a small, knowing smile as she approached them. Richard's eyes locked onto her first, his expression shifting from casual confidence to shock as recognition dawned on him. The arrogant smirk he had worn moments before vanished, replaced by a look of confusion and disbelief. Chloe turned to look at Sophie, her face twisted in confusion as she tried to piece together what was happening. "Hello, Richard," Sophie said, her voice smooth and calm, almost as if she were greeting an old acquaintance. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Richard stammered, clearly struggling to comprehend the situation. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" His voice trembled slightly, but he quickly tried to recover, straightening his posture. "This isn't what you think." Sophie didn't flinch. She had anticipated this moment, had prepared herself for his feeble excuses. "Oh, I'm sure it's exactly what I think," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I just didn't realize you were such an expert at hiding things." Richard, Chloe, still confused and clearly rattled, glanced between them, her unease growing. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice wavering. "Why are you here?" Sophie's gaze shifted to Chloe, her expression cold and calculating. "You're in the wrong place, sweetheart," Sophie said, her words dripping with venom. "You've been parading around this resort, living a life you don't even know the first thing about. All of this, the money, the luxury, the trips, it's not his to give. It's mine." Richard's face turned ashen, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sophie held up a hand, silencing him. She wasn't interested in hearing his excuses anymore. He had made his choice, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. "You thought you could live a life of luxury on my back, didn't you, Richard?" Sophie continued, her voice growing colder with each word. "You thought you could deceive me, use me, and get away with it. But you were wrong." Richard tried to defend himself, his voice shaking with panic. "Sophie, please." But Sophie cut him off again. "Save it," she said, her tone hard. "You have no idea what you've done. Do you? You've destroyed everything we built, everything I sacrificed, and now you're going to pay the price." She turned her attention back to Chloe, who was now visibly uncomfortable, realizing she had been used as a pawn in Richard's game. "And you," Sophie said, her gaze sharp. "You're just as much a part of this as he is. But you'll learn soon enough that men like Richard don't change. He's already ruined his life. You're just the next casualty." Sophie could see the wheels turning in Chloe's head as the realization hit her. She quickly pulled away from Richard, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't know," she muttered, the words trailing off as she took a step back, no longer clinging to Richard's arm. Sophie's lips curled into a small smile of satisfaction. She had done it. She had exposed Richard for who he truly was. And in doing so, She had taken control of her life. She had reclaimed the power that Richard had stolen from her. And now she was free. But Sophie wasn't finished yet. This was just the beginning. She had one more step to take to ensure that Richard would never forget the price of his betrayal. As Richard scrambled to recover, Sophie turned and walked toward the exit. Her head held high. She wasn't running from him anymore. No, she was walking away from the man who had once been her partner, but who had never truly seen her worth. The final victory was hers. As Sophie walked away from Richard and Chloe, the weight that had hung over her for so long finally lifted. She could feel the shift within herself, a transformation that had taken place quietly over the past few weeks. What had started as pain and betrayal had given way to clarity and strength. Richard's lies, his arrogance, and his infidelity no longer had a hold on her. She was free, not just from him, but from the life she had once built around him. Sophie had found herself again. And she was no longer the woman waiting in the shadows, hoping for a change that would never come. As she stepped into her car, the familiar sound of the engine starting beneath her seemed to echo the new beginning she had just embraced. The life she had fought for, the empire she had built, was hers to keep. And now, with each passing day, she would shape it on her own terms. Later that evening, Sophie stood in her office, looking out over the city lights. She had reclaimed her power. And now, there were no more compromises. No more doubts. This was her life. And she was going to live it fully. Unapologetically. And without looking back. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The weight of Richard's betrayal replaced by the promise of a future she could finally control. As Sophie raised a glass of champagne to her future, she smiled, knowing that the greatest revenge was not in punishing Richard, but in becoming the woman she had always meant to be. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more inspiring life stories. Thank you for watching.